Hey everybody, how you doing? It's been a minute, and it's been a minute because, well, you saw the subject, title and the subject matter. I mean, this is a tough one. This is one you need to get your head around. Um, and before we even get into it, I want to plant a few flags because if you see the title and you see me, this ordinary white guy in the burbs, wearing his, I'm wearing a Ralph Lauren shirt. I mean, good God, right? Where the hell does this guy get off even, hitting this subject matter and getting into this topic? And if you have that emotion, I the irony is not lost here on me. Okay, one of the reasons there was trepidation about going here, but I think if you hear me out and hear where I'm going with this, I think you'll understand. I'm not claiming some sort of victimhood or something. Good God. No more than, look, everyone's a victim of racism to a degree, I believe that, but there are degrees of victimhood, all right? And a guy like me isn't feeling any victimhood compared to the unbelievable stuff that goes on. I shouldn't say it's unbelievable, it should be believable. It happens all the time. So, happens to people I know. It happens. And it's been happening. I've been watching this for a serious part of my life. So, yeah, there's that layer. Another layer is, on a subject this serious. Here I am. I'm riffing. I have no script. I'm just talking. I am bound to not speak perfectly. I will make a mistake. I will, I'm sure, say something in some kind of generalization that it's painting a very nuanced, deep subject with too wide of a brush. I will probably be guilty of that. But if we're waiting for perfect speech, if that's the standard, then we might as well not have any speech. I mean, this is not going to be a dissertation and a college paper, and I'm not going to have, cite my source. That's a YouTube video, and I'm talking. So I think we need to just let the speech happen. People as diverse as Barack Obama, Rowan Atkinson, and Sam Harris have been saying, and I've heard them say it, and I think it's great, that when it comes to free speech, what we need is more speech. However well-intentioned it is, to be careful, be sensitive about what you say, be careful what you say. I agree. Know the subject better, learn more, keep your ears open to different views, learn. Yes, I agree, but that can't mean don't have an opinion and don't speak. The way we get through all this is more conversation. Now, I want a caveat there too, because I'm a big free speech guy, but there are people making arguments that are not in good faith about free speech these days. I'm talking about the Musks of the world and the Joe Rogans of the world, who will make, and I agree with Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel believed in free speech. The great Elie Wiesel was a hunter of Nazis, a Holocaust survivor who believed in free speech, but he also said that, but there's a caveat, there's an end, there's a point that there's something that you don't give oxygen to, and that's fascism. It's cancer and it's poison, and it doesn't get normalized and it doesn't get legitimized, and you don't let someone go there. And there are limits to free speech. Hell, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Fire in a Crowded Movie House. We do believe in there are some limits. We hate that there have to be, but there have to be some limits to free speech. Musk and Rogan will tell you, we want there to be absolute total free speech. Yes. And if you kind of can't argue with that, right? And then once you go there, then great, they can run to start talking about talking points that are straight out of fascism. And they've made an argument so they can make another argument. They never really meant the first argument. It just served their ability to be able to get. So let's be careful of that too. So please keep this in mind. All right. I mentioned that this was a personal view, and it is. And let me give you a little bit of my own life. I grew up in the coast of Maine. I'm a French Canuck clam digger from the coast of Maine. I got very into music and then increasingly into jazz. And I went to Berklee College of Music in Boston. And I spent a year there sort of floating, but by the beginning of my second year, I really fell in love with straight ahead jazz, and which was an up and coming thing. It sort of resurged, had come back, mainly because Wynton Marsalis and Bradford, we're doing this really interesting stuff. Now, where that whole movement went, you won't find me with that anymore. But at the time, it was electric, and the playing was great, and I wanted to play that kind of music because I felt it was the highest level. It was to be able, you had to play great, and you had to improvise. You had to know, you had to know the music, and you had to understand the theories and the scales and all of that, so that you develop. But there was ear playing going on, and you had to develop your ear so well and be able to hear these things and be able to do it over incredible tempos and do it live. It was, what a test. It was like this ultimate test, and I wanted to do that. I wanted to play that kind of music. And Berkeley and Boston in the 80s the racial conversation was happening. And I think a lot of us were like, well, that's in the past. Why do we, And it hit me like a ton of bricks. I soon became aware that there were white people who couldn't stand me because I was playing what they considered black people's music. There were white people who didn't care. There were black people who didn't care. And then there were black people who couldn't stand me for playing black people's music. Sometimes people went on to big careers, famous people who were, they made it known, in the deeply personal ways. They despised you for this. And it was, they were trying to get you to stop doing what you were doing, which made me want to do it more. Because I disagreed with that argument. And I didn't think they had a right to tell me what I could and could not play, or what I could and could not think. And there's a lot of that. So, that was all going on. And I came to make friends with the people who were just cool, on whether those were white guys or black guys who were cool, but there were the people who were cool are the people I stuck with, and the people who were hateful, but it was quite an eye-opener, because I hadn't done anything to anybody, but I didn't have to. The idea that I would try to play this music by itself was I was crossing some kind of line. It amazed me, why did white people care? Why was that a problem? That one blew me. But I almost understood it from the other side, but I couldn't get that. But what it made me do is I kept trying to learn. I really want to learn about that music. And when I think of music, I don't think of just, notes on a page, especially with jazz, where notes on a page are, you're really supposed, it's in many ways a heard music. And so let's do a little bit of the history of jazz. If you get into the history of jazz, this is essentially an African-American form of art, coming up in the late 19th century and early 20th century. But the big moment was the advent of recorded music. And, along with right around the beginning of the 20s, right around with, King Oliver asking Louis Armstrong to come up to play in Chicago with him. And things changed, and those first recordings with Armstrong happened. Now, the word had been around, and and look, it happened in New Orleans, which is a mix of many, all sorts of influences. So there are people sitting and go, I know there are people who say, well, it wasn't purely a black, African-American creation. And, well, it wasn't created by, WASPs in Connecticut. I think we could be pretty sure of that. So it was primarily, this was not, this was popular music. This wasn't music. This wasn't some elite music. It was popular music, it was music from the street. And it spoke to the times, and it spoke to people, it was black music for black people who had no shot, people who could get nowhere, no matter what they did, and it was their way of crying out and speaking out. The blues and all of that comes out of that. And so that really is the beginning. And then you get into Basie, say, or, Ellington and the Cotton Club and Fletcher Henderson and all of these things that come out, and Coleman Hawkins, and you're in the 30s. But what happens is, and there's no way to get around this because of the racial divide at the time, this cool stuff is out there and it's great music. And all sorts of white people sit there and heard it and go, man, I want to play that, and played it. Or played an approximation of it. Tried to play it in such a way, borrow enough from it, but then aim it towards a white audience. And we're playing for a black audience, playing for a white audience. The big bands, Goodman and, all of that. Now, there were some of those guys, Goodman wasn't some terrible character. I'm not saying that he was. I think Artie Shaw probably was a terrible character. Paul Whiteman, Jesus, is pretty much ripping off of jazz and deciding, okay, we're going to clean it up. I mean, it's just rife with the racism, but we're going to... Okay, so that happens, all right? And I think there was a recognition as the years went on, and that bop and keep going, there was a recognition, and the establishment of my own college is part of this. There was a recognition by all sorts of well-schooled white musicians that this was an extraordinary thing going on. But I'm 57 years old. That generation, guys who knew people in the 40s and 50s or played at those times, those guys were my teachers of every stripe. Also guys who played in the 60s and 70s, okay. But there were older cats who went back to those days. I've lived long enough to have known some of those people. And I'm not talking about the white guys. They didn't know they were racist, but they were incredibly racist. The times were so racist, they had no idea. You talk about institutional racism, right? And people not knowing. They had no idea. But to them, they would never think of. They would say something great about Louis Armstrong, for instance, and say, yeah, Louis Armstrong and Bix Beiderbecke. Immediately there had to be a white guy to put up next to it. They couldn't. It was amazing. It was amazing. They would talk about Basie and then say, yeah, let's talk about Tommy Dorsey. It was incredible. And when they decided to codify jazz and teach it, all right, how did that go down? They got very into turning the music into music theory, talking about chords, talking about arranging, turning an oral form into a written form, putting it in schools, creating a jazz school. That's the formation of Berkeley. But it became everything that was human about it, the culture it came from. Got rid of all that. That was removed. So jazz would be now just harmonies and harmony. Race would be removed from it. Now, again, on one level, that's not a bad idea. Get that out of there so we could just talk about the music, okay? Because they didn't want to have a racial discussion, but they never wanted to have a discussion about humanity and about, the fact that this art comes from humans. So we have to understand the cultures that they come. No, we want to remove all that, suck all that out and just make it notes on a page. And that was sort of an original sin, as it were. And that progressed, making jazz a college thing where you could learn it anywhere. And all of that nuance and all of that history and all of why people played it and what its meaning was. And you could find meaning in the rhythms, why the rhythms were the way they were. I found at college you couldn't get that information. You had to go find old jazz musicians who could tell you about why the rhythm had to be that way. Not something that you wrote down. It had to be something that was felt. And to really understand swinging and what swinging came out of, and it was as much an emotional thing that then that got imbued in the music. It wasn't a musical thing first that you learned. You had to know about the people. So there's been a history of this. There is a racial split in jazz. And increasingly, you're just going to go and learn the changes, and we're going to it's like listening to people talking about great big bands and they talk about Buddy Rich. I never liked the Rich band, honestly. I knew a lot of guys who played in that band. They were racist as all hell and didn't know it. Always they talked about the great jazz band. They always mentioned all these white guys who had played in all these studio situations. And I'm not denying that the people that they liked weren't good players. But there was a divide. They weren't talking about Miles. They were only going to talk about, somebody else. And I think they missed the boat. And I think the colleges have in large part missed the boat because they teach it as they've removed all of the humanity from it. Because we mustn't talk about racism, because talking about racism is racist. No. Talking about racism is racist. Being racist is racist. I remember the label that in the 70s. It's a great label. I like their recording. They record very well. ECM Records, right? I like ECM Records. ECM Records did all sorts of cool stuff. But ECM Records, why it's called ECM, it's editions of contemporary music. It was a jazz label. They didn't want to use the word jazz. It was going to be a European kind of take on jazz, and also didn't want to deal with the Americanness of it, although they recorded a lot of American people. But it was going to be this, again, we're going to remove all of the humanity. And once you lose that contact, that thread with what the music was about to begin with, are you even playing the same music anymore? Kinda. You're playing the same instruments. It certainly doesn't. There's some things, look, things evolve, and it's okay for things to evolve. Okay. But that removal of the culture, that is, and it's still going on. It's still going on, and it just still blows me away. And so I think, in large degree, that's what jazz has become. That schooled version of jazz, and I'm a result of it to a degree too. But even while I was doing it, and there were benefits to it, I recognized that, boy, we're not dealing with the whole picture here. Always bothered me. Always got under my skin. And, that's, to some degree, it's one of the reasons I'm sort of call myself a recovering jazz musician at this point. I don't think there's a hell of a lot of hope for it. I think it's too far gone. So I will deal with, I want to deal increasingly with styles where I don't have to, even though sometimes there's jazz things that definitely are part of my playing. Clearly, I'm a jazz player. And, part of the things that I will do, it will inform me, but I don't want to be part of that scene because I'm not going to join these various cliques. I'm not going to play it. I'm not going to play that game. I think a lot of what jazz is at this point is this. They've just denuded all of the soul from it, because it's got to be this. There's the theory police. Yeah. I love theory too, but good Lord, there's only 12 notes, kids. You can organize them a few ways, and it does come down to what emotional, connotations are there. But to fight about, is that a sus, or, or is that a suspension, or did they just, how did they voice that? And let's get into a big fight about it. To get into, it's become a battle of semantics. Listen, classical music scene has similar issues. There's just an incredible pedantic thing. They're going to have, there's an international trumpet guild that has a meet every year, and they all get together to play horns and to listen to concertos. I've never been, and I don't want to go. I love the trumpet, but the trumpet is, a way to get on the highway. It's an on-ramp to a thing called music, which is what I'm into. And I'm into humans, and I'm into what we say. So movements that go away from that. But when it comes to jazz, man, I'm a big believer in education. One of the worst things that ever happened to jazz when it was adopted by the Academy, because it had to conform to that world, which is into codifying, right, and deciding what the knowledge is and looking backward. It's not where you create new things. It can't be, right? So, and everything's been codified. So now we just keep repeating and running around in circles. That's being creative. The worst thing that could have happened to jazz is that academic acceptance, and then the academically changing. Okay, let's make sure that we remove all of the humanity from it. And that impetus, the need to do that, was done by overwhelmingly white professors. I don't think they even recognized what they were doing while they were doing it. It's not some conspiracy theory, It's just one of those evolutions. Folks that were, I remember when I was in college, there were a lot of us there watching these guys who used to play in the Rich Band, for instance, who were teachers at Berkeley, and listening to what they would say, and we would sit there and go, they don't get it. They have no idea. That generation was just incapable. They had grown up in such racist times. They were comparatively liberal, and they were racist. That's how bad it was. So, yeah. I don't have a great answer on this, but I don't think you can make believe that hasn't happened. And I don't hear enough people talking about it, but it clearly has happened. And it's, people do have a tendency to get me down, man. We find a way to create these wonderful things, and then we blow it, and we tear it down and screw it up. Not always, but boy, a lot. I remember someone said that the three great inventions in America were baseball, the U.S. Constitution, and jazz music. And we've just about ruined all three. The National League pitchers don't hit. We've took all the nuance, we lobotomized baseball. I don't know what we're doing with the U.S. Constitution at this point. It's in deep freaking trouble. Half the people, if you put a Bill of Rights up for a vote, it probably wouldn't pass in most states. We don't believe in any of that anymore. Scary. We don't know our own history. And, jazz is kind of something from the past at this point. Unbelievable moments. And people who play better than ever right now, saying nothing. Because it's all about, gee, look at the upper extension I played on the chord there. And, instead of being about soul and about saying something to people, which is what art's supposed to be about. So, yeah, sorry to be a downer. I hope the flags I planted earlier on maybe help with this. And I hope you understand. And in the end, you know, when I talk about racism and jazz, I'm looking at white people. It's still going on. It's still institutionalized without any awareness that, you know, by removing the soul, removing the humanity from it, was removing black people from it, by itself a racist act. We're going to make it an academic, clean academic thing. It should put the hairs on you. Can you imagine thinking that? And yet this is the accepted dogma. So we got to do better. We've got to do better. And whatever music we play, at least, you know, don't let it turn into this academic thing. It's still got to be about the swoon and the emotion. All right, guys, I hope you'll forgive me for going into this kind of topic. Feel free to, you know, you may not like this, but if you like it, give me a like. Or feel free to give me a comment. I'm sure, I'm telling you now, I'm sure there are things I've said they were either I could have put better, etc. But I think we need to talk. I think talking more, it'd be better to talk and get some things wrong and have messy talk than have no talk. We need the messy talk. All right, guys. I'll talk to you in a week.